Okay, so in this section, we're going to be looking at the beginning of World War II and try to understand, how this thing got going. So this is exclusively focused on World War II, and yeah. So we'll get to the map in a second, but for the United States, the war really gets going because of the war in Pacific. As we looked at last couple of weeks, we've seen that the U.S. interest in the Pacific has really grown. Um, right, all these islands across the Pacific, Hawaii included, but even the Philippines. So once Japan began to have its own aspirations for imperialism and this kind of purity doctrine that went over them, it basically began to, in some ways, you can argue, start World War II even before the Germans got going, because they're already doing this like conquest of China and its neighbors, which put both Britain and the U.S. had interest there on alert and set them up against Japan, particularly the U.S. And that'll have big consequences because the U.S. will put a oil embargo on Japan as we get closer and closer to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So there's a preemptive attack on Pearl Harbor. Um, the president, who has kind of kept the country out of war up to this point, even though he's supporting the Allies, um, um, begins to mobilize the U.S. to fight this war. So, how did Pearl Harbor happen? Um, Bottom line, it does seem to be a failure of intelligence. I don't really buy into conspiracy theories, so the main idea we can take away from that, is obvious without going to conspiracy, is basically they really dropped the ball, and Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Didn't take out all the fleet though, so that would be important. This then produces a really kind of shadow dark moment in U.S. history. U.S. history in relationship to Asian Americans has already been terrible since the arrival of the Chinese. As we saw with like Chinese Immigration Act 1882, and then even what was going on against the Japanese after World War One. This all kind of sets up after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the internment into concentration camps of Japanese um, Americans, and in particular, we're talking mostly Japanese Americans, talking American citizens. So you can see the numbers there. These were debated in court. Most famous being Fred Korematsu. You can read about him in your book. Now, eventually, you had some Japanese American soldiers wanting to join the ranks of the military to kind of prove their patriotism, which is just kind of a crummy way to put it, but that's basically what they did. And they were two of the more decorated groups of soldiers, these two different regiments. They're two most decorated soldiers in the whole war. So it's a really fascinating history. There's a ton of videos I attached here that I'd like you to watch later on. Okay, so let's see here. Oh, that's the European. Let's go really quick, and I can kind of use a map to explain what's happening here. So, um, there's Pearl Harbor. What's going to happen is what the Americans are going to do is what's called island hopping. So this map is helpful because it kind of shows you a couple of things. And again, you have access to my notes, so go check them out later. But it shows how the U.S. is going to hop around these islands, eventually try to hit mainland Japan. Obviously, that's not going to happen. Japan's going to get bombed at Nagasaki and Hiroshima to end the war. It also shows you the extent of how much the um, the extent to what the Japanese had control of Asia at this time period. So, pretty significant. Okay, so the U.S. joins the war. They do that island hopping campaign. Battle of Midway is really important as a turning point in the Pacific War because basically after that the island hopping begins. Um, and as I mentioned, Japan has a big hold over Asia, particularly the Philippines are taken. So the U.S. does the Pacific War against Japan, and it joins the British in northern Africa, and it's basically like Desert War. It's famous for the tank battles between General Patton of the U.S. and General Rommel of Germany. Um, they're successful, so then they move up, invade Italy, while at the same time, Stalin and the Russians are fighting the Germans in Russia. And after Stalingrad, the Russians start to push the Germans out and move towards. They move towards Germany. So the U.S. is deciding to, or the Allies, I should say, are deciding to open up a second front, a Western front, in order to kind of sandwich Germany. So, really quick, show you how this happens. So you can see here, um, Stalingrad's here. After that, the U.S. is gonna, the Russians are gonna push, try to head to Berlin. The U.S. has already helped liberate this area and moving up through here. And now, the idea is to start up with an invasion of France. And basically, who's going to get to Berlin first is kind of the idea. So that's D-Day. It's that big land sea invasion by the Allies. Within a couple of months, France is liberated from the Nazis, and then once the Allies, led by the U.S., start heading to Germany, Germany has what's called the Battle of the Bulge. This is the biggest counterattack, kind of takes the Americans by surprise. This is then followed up with an intense bombing campaign. So if you think about like the difference between World War One and World War Two, World War One barely features aerial attack, where World War Two is all about the bombing, and just because technology is better by now. And so it's an intense bombing. We always talk about Hiroshima, Nagasaki, obviously because the atomic bomb was dropped, and the amount of lives that died in like one shot. But both Germany and Tokyo, Japan in general, certain spots were really heavily firebombed even before the Americans dropped the atomic bomb. So this is part of history that's oftentimes left out. It's just how bad the bombing was in World War II. Okay. Okay, so in the midst of this, the U.S. and Russia, particularly since they're kind of in the driver's seat, they plan a conference in Yalta where they basically draw up what the Cold War world would look like, or the post-World War II world would look like. Not the Cold War yet, but it's going to be. And this is the dynamic that happens because, like I said, they're the two that are kind of winning the war. So once the Americans pass into Germany and moving along around the same time period, Russia finally goes into Berlin, and it's basically a bloodbath. And in fact, Russia is going to get Hitler first. He'll commit suicide before they can get their hands on him, but it will be the Russians that get to the capital first, and it's pretty much an intense bloodbath. Here's a picture. Actually, it's I think it's one of the in a war that killed so many. This picture of Americans and Russians meeting up at the Elbe River, I think it's really nice. Specifically because the Cold War, they're going to be sworn enemies, but at this point, there's a lot of these pictures taken of these two different groups of men that have been fighting, who finally kind of like know that the war is almost over and they can go home. When the Russians, they're the ones that get there first, and then the Americans discover the death camps, and the Holocaust victims, they're all pretty much blown away by this. Um, Somewhere around 6 million Jews are purposely killed in the Holocaust, and then on top of that, many, many million more. Um, so it's a pretty significant historical event that humanity is still trying to wrestle with. And that in some ways leads into the acceptance, specifically led by the United States, of the nation of Israel in 1948, which still well, we'll talk about that later. We get to Middle East talks and stuff later on this semester, but that's when Israel comes into being, comes eve of the Holocaust, or the end of the Holocaust. Okay, so there's another meeting. The Germans are dealt with, and now Harry Truman is president. We'll talk more about him in a couple of weeks. Um, but there's a discussion on, like, okay, how do we go and deal with Japan now, since these firebombing of Japan has not led to them surrendering, and as the Americans get closer and closer to Japan, particularly the Battle of Okinawa, and other fights like that, show that the Japanese are not willing just to kind of lay over and die. In fact, the fighting is getting more and more intense. Um, and Truman's kind of afraid of yielding Asia too much to Stalin, right? Because the U.S. has kind of been the one that almost exclusively dealing with Japan. And so this is one of these are all factors. The fact that the fighting is getting more intense as the soldiers getting closer and closer to Japan, and that now Stalin wants to get involved. This leads to the decision, and the fact that they tested it and it worked. This leads to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, following the bombing, the military command, the emperor, powers taken away from them, and the Americans come in. And we will talk. Probably one of the first things we talk about is the Cold War dimensions, what the U.S. does in Japan, and what U.S. does in Germany. Because now, like Truman's fear, you're going to have the Cold War breakout, and it's just going to change basically the world and U.S. Position in the world from this point on.